Hey, good evening, everybody. Conway was asking before you caught on what it is I look at when I look this way. I don't often do it much in the wintertime because it's dark, but I have a window here and I look out on the yard, look out on my garden. But for some reason, sitting here, I want to tell you instead about something I don't quite see from here, which is this full grown um, crab apple that's in our front yard that is blooming white. It's just absolutely magnificent right now. And I've named that tree Alma, which means soul. You didn't really think too much about it. That's just what came to me when I was in the mood for naming trees a few years back. And, but that's somehow the connotation that I found in this beautiful white tree. And the sense of a tree as teaching me something about faith. Well, it's always a little hard to put into words, but the tree's just immersed in the seasons, trusting the seasons, which in climate changes might not be entirely trustworthy, but it just follows its nature and blooms. And I believe we are like that, if we could ever possibly believe that we too are nature, that it is our destiny, our nature to bloom and bear fruit. And we've all done that in various ways, but in the Buddhist teaching, there's a notion that's put out there of awakening as when that really happens in the fullest way, that blooming. And of course, when you just hear that and you don't know it for yourself, you've never experienced awakening for yourself, it can be just a word. But sometimes even just the word awakens something. Even just the word awakening awakens something. There's something already in us that is headed toward it, headed towards waking up. The sap is rising. You wouldn't be here in this class if there wasn't already a glimmer of something that you're headed to, that is the fullness and the fulfillment of all this life and learning and things that we go through. There's something that draws us farther. In these words, I think of some of them, the unconditioned, asankata. That doesn't mean much to many people. It simply points to something beyond the way we all feel kind of conditioned. We all feel in bondage in some ways, in our minds and in our hearts, in our lives. We never quite feel the freedom that we know is our birthright somehow. And so that word is like a cipher, the unconditioned reality, the asankata Dhamma. Or another one you kind of draw out of the Buddhist tradition, the anatta Dhamma, the deathless reality. What could that be? It's not necessarily an idea of I'm going to go on forever. There is a deathless reality the Buddha talks about. What would that be? It's again a kind of a cipher, given the world we know is always full of things being born and dying. Or the unborn. The unborn, the undying reality. What is that? It doesn't help so much to speculate. But you can start, if you can find it in yourself, there is if I can use the word longing for it, there's a longing for this freedom, this place, if I can use that word, place of the deathless reality, where there is a security, if I can use that word, not found in everything that we know. These are interesting words. But nonetheless, there's something in our hearts that's already primed for it. That's what I'm pointing to. And there's an emotion that is really not found in our language. It's found in the Pali language, samvega. It's the emotion that in us that turns towards awakening. And all the translations are kind of funky. If you translate it as a sort of dissatisfaction with the world, that can get mixed up in all sorts of aversion and stuff like that. It's not necessarily, but you may get a little of the flavor of that. Urgency is a word that I sometimes use. Sometimes we feel the urgency of freedom. Like, what are we here for? We have a sense we're here for something. And when we hear about awakening, maybe it arouses some sense of urgency. And I've met people who have strong samvega. Sometimes they've been students. Sometimes there have been other meditators I've met along the path. And there is a fierce determination in them to do whatever it takes in their life to awaken. And which can sometimes mean dropping everything, leaving their life, practicing intensively. Doesn't have to mean that. But that's an easy sign of urgency. Something that is like, this really matters. In fact, this matters more than all these other things that seem to consume my time and energy. It's worth actually clearing out something for this possibility. And one of the lovely things about the Dharma is that it doesn't make you like wait forever for a touch of what it's teaching. So right in the experience of mindfulness, right in presence, there's already a taste of the unborn, of the deathless reality. It's already there. Buddhism talks about factors of awakening. And by that, it means factors of our mind that are common, that are ordinary in a certain sense, that are rooted in awakening. They root us in this possibility and in some sense, the awakening that was already here in us, just obscure. And so I was pointing to this a bit when we were breathing today in meditating, pointing to the possibility of breathing in the heart, of a presence, a fuller presence, which isn't just a kind of a rote noticing of the breath, which is kind of where mindfulness sometimes begins, a rote noticing of the breath, and then the frustration because the mind just keeps slipping off and slipping off, slipping off. But there's a possibility that one begins to the heart actually begins to settle with the breath and around the breath. One begins to feel a fuller presence with that. And ironically, with a fuller presence with the breath itself seems to become more interesting, more full, more worthy of attention. It's this strange sort of thing that as we give something our fuller presence, it seems more worthy of presence. When we're not really giving it a whole lot of presence, it seems kind of boring and not interesting. So right there, you can already begin to feel, and it's very much a matter of feeling, the way the presence is rooted in awakening. It's a taste of it. And as we taste it more fully, it can arouse more samvega. It can arouse more of this sense of the urgency, the importance of this in life, of waking up. I spoke a little bit last week about how, my first flush of faith in the Buddhist tradition, and in particularly came through a retreat and contact with some teachers who embodied something that I intuitively sensed is what my heart was headed for, what I most deeply wanted. And it caused me a little bit of chagrin, a little bit of shame in the recognition that I had sort of substituted something less than that in terms of studying theology rather than actually following what I wanted, which was more of a knowledge of God, if I can put that away. That was the language, at least, that I had back then to express it. That's like the birth of this in my heart, the idea and the felt recognition. It's not just the idea. In some sense, my ego caught a hold of the awakening thing right away too. And so I'd spend a lot of time on my cushion after I first learned to meditate, imagining the perfect person that I was going to become and how I would be like, in a certain sense. I didn't admit it to myself. I saw it afterwards, but there's a certain way that I felt like I would kind of be better than everybody if I was awake. And so there's just a whole lot of ego tripping that was happening as well. So that's kind of the idea of awakening. The idea of awakening can kind of hook that, oh, wouldn't that be cool kind of thing in the mind. Wouldn't that be special? That isn't the deeper thing that I'm really talking about, the longing of the heart to awaken, the sense that this is a birthright, that this is what we are made for. I can put it in such strong terms. This is what we are made for. And of course, the story conflicts with the story of our education. What we are taught from a more materialist point of view, the earth is about and why we're here. Well, it's kind of accidental. You get right down to it. Through mechanisms of survival, things got more complicated. And by accident after accident, something without any particular cause or final purpose arose in the world, human intelligence. And there's no necessity to it. It doesn't fit with our heart's experience. And I'm not going to try to reconcile the two because I am I won't say believer in science because it's not about belief. I understand it enough. I understand the evidence enough to know where it's coming from. But I also understand the philosophy, the default metaphysics that science often falls back on, even when it says it doesn't have a metaphysics, that has already, scientific method has already screened out in the name of objectivity, in the name of looking at the things that can be quantified and measured and repeated by a neutral observer, observed from the outside. It's already screened reality. It's already sifted reality through its screen. And a lot of things get sifted out. What I'm talking about often gets lumped as subjectivity, which in the modern world kind of has a bad reputation. It's seen as a source of bias. It's seen as a source of delusion. It's very rarely held up as a place of truth, that one is a subject. And so faith has a hard time in this world, I have to say. this that I'm talking about, this sense that one has that it's not random. There is a reason for being here. That awakening is possible. The heart's freedom is possible. And that has something to do with a reason for being here. You know, all of those sorts of words, they can't be verified externally. Sorry, I don't think they can. We can look at the evidence in people's lives, we can study that and say, people with faith live longer. People with faith are happier. They're 25% happier than the people who aren't, as studied in such a quantitative analysis. We can do that sort of thing. But it's only our own inner experience which gives us access to this. And if, you know, you've never really had the experience I'm talking about of having it be awakened in you, it's okay. You know, it's part of the story too, is so many people go through life completely submersed in their life and what's being asked of them by their culture, their bodies, their desires. That the what's it all for hardly has any space to arise. That seems to be how it is, you know, just as an external observer. However, I am convinced, which is sort of faith that's been tried out a bit, that in everyone there is a germ of what I'm talking about. So just see where it lands in you. Let it land in you. And sometimes I have to talk past your head to get certain things to land in you, because the head may be, you know, kind of figuring out where does what he say fits in my belief, fits in my thoughts, in the way that I've constructed things. Oh, it doesn't quite fit. And so the head's kind of doing all this whole thing, which is its job. I'm not, but sometimes these realities, these felt realities, such as faith, they don't quite fit in our maps, in our internal maps very well. And if we begin to listen to them and follow them, they may take us way off the map. They may rewrite the map. I love Buddhist psychology because it's a map of people who have kind of crossed the territory that I've been interested in crossing in my life. And it even then, you know, even all of that sort of Buddhist intellectuality, which is in the Dharma, it's all a bunch of straw compared to the taste that have come through practice of what it's talking about. And I'm quite even willing occasionally to throw that map aside to follow inklings inside of myself. So, you know, so I'm talking about just the birth of faith, the birth of recognizing faith in these simple experiences that come about in exposure to spiritual teachings. And invariably, I think, in this tradition, and I actually think it's true in other traditions, but it's a little more obscure. In this tradition, faith is always kind of pointing you back to yourself. It's always pointing you back to your own discernment. So there arises the question, what can I trust in my experience? And the first answer one is given is be mindful, be present. Notice what's actually happening in the present moment. You can begin to trust that. And that, in a sense, is talked about as taking refuge in the Buddha. Okay. So that's a very traditional kind of thing that is out there in Buddhism. You take refuge in the Buddha, you take refuge in the Dharma, you take refuge in the Sangha. And, on a certain level, that means kind of believing that the story of the awakening of this historical individual is real and the teaching that flows from that is reliable. You may get there, you may not, but what it means more immediately is the Buddha. This is the Buddha. That's the Buddha. The old saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. It's pointing to the way that the Buddha is not something external. The Buddha is not just a historical individual. It's a potential of every human being. Buddha, awakened, it's kind of a past participle of buddhati, the verb to wake up. It's the same thing you would use when you get up in the morning. The awakened one, Buddha, is also us. It's also us. It's pretty cool. So, how do we begin to trust that in ourselves? When what most immediately meets our mindfulness, when we look at what's actually going on, the mind is rather insane. It tells us all sorts of things that aren't true. It's constantly judging other people, judging ourselves. If you pay any attention to its judgments, they are contradictory. They're not consistent at all. They're laced with fear if you poke around in them very much. And that's only the beginning of it. We are filled with desire for things that won't make us happy. We believe getting more of them will make us happy. When it doesn't, we try to get more of them. And we are constantly rejecting different aspects of reality as if somehow rejecting them did something about them. So that's just scratching the surface. I won't go too deeply into our insanity. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I think you probably all had enough practice to notice that so much in us is kind of insane and deluded. And our hearts get attached to things and place our security in them that are going to fail us someday, that aren't actually worthy of the trust we put in them. So this is all important to faith. This is all important to faith, this recognition that we're kind of deluded, our hearts and minds are deluded, and they're not trustworthy. And that we have to hold that paradox that what this tradition points us back to is ourselves. Be a light unto yourself. To quote the man, be a light unto yourself. Well, that word could also be translated as island, which is also an interesting spin on it. But both of them are warning you against too much reliance, too much dependence on things outside of you if you're really interested in liberation, really interested in the heart's freedom and truth, being too dependent on things outside of you. That's not to say that teachers aren't useful. That's not to say that institutions aren't useful. is not to say that suttas and scriptures and writings, sacred writings, are not useful. It's not to say that commandments and precepts are not useful. They're all really helpful in our education. But they're all training wheels when it comes down to it. So you can eventually balance and ride the bike. They're training wheels. I think that's enough for tonight. We'll see where that takes us in the discussion.